to hearing from you as we run our polls. So what I'm going to now, I'm going to invite our research fellow at CPIT, CPIT's AI Policy Center, which is now the East African AI Hub, Ms. Florence Ogonjo, to give us some opening remarks and to introduce this webinar and tell us about, other webinars and other things that are coming after this. Florence?
Good afternoon, everyone. I know it's reading as someone else's name other than my own, but allow me to use her device for the welcoming session. So good afternoon to everyone. I'm very grateful for all of you for joining and making time to join the webinar session this afternoon. Just a small highlight of the AI governance webinar series that CPIT is starting, and particularly the AI team. It's going to be a series of 3 key webinars that will be sharing generally the work that the CPIT AI team has been doing over the year. It will be sharing key resources with respect to AI governance and AI policy in Kenya and within the continent, and how that has evolved and how that has grown through different thematic areas. And today we'll be starting with the ethical component of looking at data with respect to that. So I am also looking forward to this session and it being a key learning session, especially in consideration of the elements of data labelers and ethical data, and how AI generally and how data generally is viewed within the AI value chain, and giving it sort of a human perspective when we're looking at it from a data component. So I'm looking forward to that, and I hope the rest of you will get to learn, not just from the panelists who will be speaking today, but also from the work we will share as CPIT. So karibuni sana, and thank you so much, Joss. Over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Florence, for your remarks and for introducing the webinar series. And we really look forward to the rest of the webinars, because I think this introduction part will handle data, but the rest will talk about other steps in the AI development cycle, where we can insert ethical principles and how we can do that. And that's also something that's going to come up in today's webinar. So let me just give an overview of how we are going to run this session. I'm going to briefly introduce the work that has led to this webinar from my end, and then I'm going to welcome our panelists. We have 5 wonderful experts. I'm going to introduce them to you, and then we are going to start the panel discussion, where I will direct questions to each panelist. And then after that, we can have a Q&A session where we can engage with the audience. So briefly, the title of the webinar and really the work is ethical AI, or the title of my work was Ethical AI Development in Kenya, the role of ethical data sourcing and governance. So I wanted to look at ethical AI at the data curation stage and what issues arise at that stage. So what does unethical data sourcing look like at that stage? And then what would ethical data sourcing look like? Meaning, what do we need to do to correct those unethical practices? And then we also looked at a few case studies, which I think will come up as our panelists speak, of what ethical sourcing of data looks like and what really the model should be that we will follow. And so unethical sourcing has come up in many ways. We've been hearing a lot of cases, either to do with copyright violations, cases to do with data workers, and the work that they do in curating data, either collecting or labeling and curating. And all those cases have really been pointing to unethical issues that arise at the data curation stage. Yeah. So number one is intellectual property violations. We've had a lot of cases, especially in the West, that have actually gotten to the court. There's a lot of case law against OpenAI, which is the major AI development company that I think everyone in the world is aware of. We've heard of scraping of data, often copyrighted data, and the conflict there between IP rights and training data. Then there has also been exploitative scraping of African data sets. We've heard of health surveys, health data being just used without any, without limitations. We've also heard of exploitative labor practices, and that's going to be a major part of today's conversation. We are going to look mainly at data workers and the labor concerns at that stage of AI development. And then we've also heard of issues of invalid consent, or fake consent, as I would call it. An example is the WorldCoin case, the infamous WorldCoin case, where a company which is tied to, again, the major AI company in the world that came to Kenya and other countries, and has gone to other countries and collected large amounts of iris scans from people for in exchange for a small amount of money. And the Kenyan courts declared that invalid consent because it was coerced consent in some form. Then we've also heard of cases of community exclusion, where people go to communities, collect data, be it language data or agricultural data, and they just collect the data and go away with it. And the community doesn't see the people who collected the data again. So these are just examples of unethical data sourcing and how it comes up. And what would ethical sourcing of data look like, so that now we achieve ethical AI by at least starting at that point with ethical practices. And it will be the opposite of the unethical practices I've mentioned. So, for example, informed consent and valid consent, making sure that when you're collecting data, you tell the data subjects what the data is for. You follow all the data protection principles. But for example, the Kenya Data Protection Act, the principles of lawful processing of data. We have also equitable benefit sharing with communities. The unethical practice I've mentioned is where people just extract data from communities and just run away. But what would the ethical side of that look like is at least share the benefits. So we've heard of an example where an organization collected agricultural data, for climate smart practices, farming practices. And once they developed a tool, they then shared the tool with the same farmers who prepared the data. That at least shows that you're sharing the benefits with these farmers. Also ensuring that the data sets are inclusive. So for example, when collecting language data, making sure that you're collecting language data that incorporates all parts of a community. Also, data worker protection is a big part of ethical data sourcing. So just with this context, I would like us to jump to the panel discussion, and I'll start by introducing our panelists. So first we have Mr. Victor Ndede, who is a lawyer. He's the Tech and Human Rights Manager at Amnesty International Kenya. He's a privacy professional, a human rights lawyer, and he provides legal and policy analysis currently for Amnesty International Kenya in their digital rights programs and campaigns. He leads the programs team, and they work on strengthening data governance in Kenya and East Africa, besides working on digital rights for children and young people. He's an advocate for a safe internet for all persons, and he's experienced in legal and policy research, policy analysis, legislative frameworks, engagement, and human rights monitoring, expert monitoring. He also serves on IREX's Transform Community Advisory Board, advising on tech-facilitated gender-based violence response in Kenya. He has previously served as the policy officer for Amnesty International Kenya. So that's Victor Ndede. He's going to give us a great perspective in terms of the human rights concerns for data workers. Next, we have Ms. Joanne, who is the president of the Data Labelers Association. Joan Kinyua is the president and one of the founding members, and Data Labelers Association aims to give data labelers and annotators a collective voice. And these are often the invisible workers in the AI development lifecycle. So you will often not hear of their role, but then all the tools that we use really rest on the shoulders of people like Joan. Next, I will introduce Ms. Rebecca Yakitimbo. Rebecca is a feminist technologist, a researcher, and a community leader at the nexus of AI, language data, gender justice, and digital equity. She has held fellowships with Google, Mozilla, and Internet Society, and is a National Geographic Society explorer. Rebecca was part of the Kondoa Community Network and is of the Kondoa Community Network, where she designed governance models and trained women technicians to close gender gaps in connectivity. As a National Geographic explorer, she founded the community-based wildlife network to mitigate human wildlife conflict through locally driven monitoring and coexistence strategies. Rebecca supports the African Women's School of AI and curates the Gendering AI conference, creating spaces for feminist, decolonial, and community-rooted conversations on the future of technology. As part of the APC's LockNet project, she facilitates emerging communities of practice, supports research on community-centered connectivity, local service, and documents best practices for equitable, locally led digital ecosystems. So Rebecca's work is going to really give us a great perspective on inclusion, because we'll often mention inclusion at the end of the AI development lifecycle, where we have a product and we're saying it's excluding some people. But Rebecca will tell us how exactly our communities and how our people, how our data workers and AI developers ensuring to embed inclusivity at the start, at the data collection and data curation stage. Next, we will have Ephantus Kanyugi. He's the Vice President of the Data Labelers Association, which I mentioned aims to give a collective voice for data workers and data labelers and annotators. And he's going to tell us more about his work and about the perspectives of data workers and data labelers and annotators together with Joan. And finally, we will have Sipit Irene Makau, who is an AI governance and data governance researcher. And her work also wants to really explore feminist perspectives around AI governance and ensuring that women's rights are embedded in AI governance work. So that's our panel. I don't know if the cameras are on, maybe you can wave. And then as I ask each panelist their question, they can always ask. Please start with an introduction, tell us a bit about your work, and then respond to your first question. But on to my first question, that's to Ms. Joan Kinyua. So I want us to start by understanding what the Data Labelers Association is. So what's your work? What do you do? Why did you start this association? Why is this body necessary for data workers in Kenya? So if you could kindly just tell us a bit about the association and your work, and also in telling us about that, maybe differentiate for us what the different data workers are. So I've heard of data labelers, there's data annotators, and there's other types of data workers. And I feel like in removing the shield or removing the blindfold that we have to these data workers is really understanding the different roles. So what does each worker do, and how does the work sort of contribute to the AI lifecycle? Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. So as introduced earlier, I am Joan Kinyua, the president of Data Labelers Association. So I think I'm going to answer this question by giving a little background about myself and also on the work that we are doing at the Data Labelers Association. I started work back in 2015 as a data labeler, and I started in a company called Summer. So the role of a data labeler, or my work back then, was to do research. And the type of research that you're doing is sort of like look for labeling jobs. So data labeling jobs is where you're drawing boxes or any sort of shapes that are required by the project. First, you're given. So for self-driving cars, you're supposed to draw boxes around traffic lights, around road markings, around people, around trees, around everything else that is 100 meters away from the road and everything basically on the road. So that is a little about the data annotation or the data labeling. There's also the transcription side where you're supposed to transcribe emails, where you're supposed to like highlight the different components of emails, especially the ones that are applying for jobs and all those things. So you feel like, so you're told to highlight where the addresses are, and then there's different keywords that the organizations want. So you're supposed to highlight the keywords that are really needed by the project. So that again is for the AI production of HR tools. That is why you're seeing nowadays you can submit an email and you can get a direct rejection because the system has been taught to recognize the different keywords that are required by the employer. There's also where we are doing medical AI, despite the fact that you're not a medical practitioner, where you're given scans, mammograms, and all those things, and then you're supposed to teach this AI how to recognize different things, which is very troublesome for people who do not know what you're being exposed to. In this space, in this project, you're given maybe a scan, and then you're told this how a vein should look like. This is how like different components of the scans, and then you're supposed now to teach AI how to recognize these things. So from the news or from the publications that are out there, you can see that they're saying now AI can detect if you have cancer 5 years before. It's because that system again has been taught from the different patterns that you're seeing. And it's a data labeler that is sitting behind the screen and that is teaching these people how to recognize these patterns. And now the doctors or the people that are trying to come up with cures for cancer can now recognize the different trends that are seeing. Thirdly, is you can see usually in movies, because I don't know if it's available here in Kenya, there's this vacuum robot. It detaches itself from the something itself, and then it does the chores, sort of like moves around different things that are down on the floor, and you can see it recognizes a toy, it recognizes a remote that is on the ground, it recognizes very many things that are maybe on the ground, but it knows where the dirt is, where the stains are, and all those things. So there are people behind their screens teaching these systems how to recognize these things. The reason as to why the Data Labelers Association is in existence is because we are seeing all these things are trending. Everybody is attributing these successes to the artificial intelligence itself. When you're having conversations with people, nobody wants to believe the fact that there are people behind their screens who are actively trying to train these models how to recognize this stuff. So again, when we are working in these projects, there are a lot of challenges that we face. First of all, usually communication is one way where it's them giving us instructions on what you're supposed to do. It's the big tech hiring and firing as they like, without like arbitrarily closing accounts without any consent of what, despite the fact that you've worked on this platform for a very long time. It's the mental health safeguards that are not in existence, despite the fact that you're working on projects that are sometimes very gruesome and very graphic. It's the social protections. We do not have any social protections. Again, payment is it's not, you cannot plan yourself accordingly when it comes to payment, because you might get paid this week, you might not get paid the next week. So most of us are living in debt because you're living in you're constantly waiting for the money, but you do not have the money. So you have to get some money from somewhere so that you can you can survive. It's the um, you cannot predict the unpredictability nature of these jobs, and most of the times they're termed as entry level jobs. But I don't know why they're being termed as entry level jobs, but we've been working in this space for more than 5 years. Personally, I started in 2015, so you can tell like it's 10 years plus in that space. So the reason as to why we felt it was the best, like forming an association was the best thing, is we did not have any recourse for the challenges that we were facing. We did not have people to talk to. We did not, from the learning that we had the whole of 2024, there were no laws that were outlined for specifically people working in the digital space. Plus, we were not being recognized, so we felt like we should also educate ourselves and also educate the people on why we are important and why we should be protected and why these jobs should be there, yes, but the safeguards and all those things are really required. So it's just us trying to fight for the workers. It's the workers for the workers. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that overview. So you've talked a bit about the main challenges that workers have faced, and it seems that the laws that exist, maybe the employment laws, were not enough to protect you, maybe because of the unique nature of this work. So Irene will tell us a bit more about the laws, the labor laws, and why or why not they're not sufficient, for example. What I would ask you, Joan, maybe now because you've been in the work for, as you said, more than 5 years or so, you've formed this association. So far, have you seen any improvement in the laws and policies in addressing your concerns, or what would you want to see in terms of policies and laws to address your concerns and the concerns of data workers?
I feel like the job we are doing, we are becoming hopeless because of, first of all, the Business Law Amendment 2024. So that's like a slap in the face to the workers. It's a direct like insult because if you read the amendments themselves, they were really not making sense. What the amendment was like, who the amendment was trying to protect is the big tech themselves by being specifically indicated that we cannot sue the big tech. But when you look at the harm that these companies are bringing to the people, it's like irreversible. Other than policies being protected work, other than policies protecting workers, we are feeling like it's against the workers because apart from that, there's no other bill I feel like has outrightly spoken about the workers. Most of them are usually concentrating on the Ubers and the Globals, but none on the AI space. And that is where I feel the conversation should be because this is the most um, exploited space.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. So in our research work, we keep saying, these are the invisible workers, these are the invisible workers, but I like how you really contextualized it, like the tool, the Roomba tool that I think it can be a vacuum cleaner or whatever that moves around and maybe it has sensors to recognize the toy and to recognize the remote, but you're the one who taught it that that's a remote and that's what a remote looks like. And then, so the invisibility starts there where we are fascinated by the AI tools, by the chatbots, but we don't know that you trained it. And then the invisibility continues in terms of the protections that you require, but you're not getting them because for some reason there's a battle between the innovation and the fascination with, again, the technology versus the people behind the scenes. Thank you so much for sharing that. And we hope we can keep finding solutions. So you work with Ephantas Kanyugi, your vice president. Ephantas, I would want to also hear a bit. Thank you so much, John. To hear about a bit about your experience. You might have had a different experience from Joan. Maybe you can just share when you started the data work, what you've done in this field, and maybe you can share a bit about other people that you know who do this work. For example, are a majority of data workers labelers? Are a majority of them content moderators? Where is there more concentration in terms of data workers? And of course, in that you can just talk about the various roles you've taken. And also, I'm curious in terms of the positive aspects of the opportunities that you've seen people take advantage of in this work. What are some of these opportunities? Can feel free to talk about any of that. Thanks.
A detailed question. I'll do my best to answer. So my name is Ephantas Kanyugi, Vice President and Operations Lead of the Data Labelers Association. I joined the space in 2018, and I would say a majority of the people work in a hybrid sort of situation where It's not just data annotation. You find that you're doing a collective of different things. So it can be data collection, it can be the actual data annotation, it can be data extraction. So it's a lot. It's a lot of things compounded into one, which is why we chose the term data labeling. And ideally, the work is usually very, very interesting because you're working on new technology, it's new projects and everything. But what's the problem is then sometimes the nature of the work, but mostly the structure of work, the conditions that people find themselves working in. So the best description would be to give an illustration of a company that we worked for. So we used to work for a company as trainers. And what would happen is we would have to recruit people. We had a target of 100 workers. And for these workers, we had to, bring people. And then for the first week, we would do training. This is just show them how the tool looks, what work looks like, how you're supposed to go about working on tasks, what you're supposed to do, all that. Then you get to week 2. So for the week 1 during training, people are actually working. And then you get to week 2, people are now working, but now under supervision. It's more of now you start the actual work. And then you get to week 3, where now they start working by themselves, but under supervision, where they're basically, in case you have a question, I don't shadow you to see what you're doing. And then in week 3, you work on the projects by yourself, but in case you have questions, you can ask me as your trainer. And then by week 4, you're expected now to at least be assimilated with the system and be able to work by yourself. But then you'd find that for the whole month, and here now you required maybe the requirements are very crazy because some projects require you to have a degree. So it's not entry level work, it's like specialized work. It's like we have a project, but in order for you to qualify, you need to have a degree, a master's in biology, you need to have a master's in economics, you need to have a bachelor's degree in medicine, you need to have this and that and that. So it's not entry level work. And then next, you're supposed to have a high-end machine. So they give you specifications. It's like you need a Core i5 laptop. It has 11th generation. You need, for example, 20 Mbps minimum. So because for majority of us in Kenya, you understand that this is a cost that you're incurring to be able to do this work. But then you find that for the whole month that I've been training 100 people, nobody has gotten paid. So it's just, we got to a point where it's like you need to have a massive backlog. So you've been working for 2 months, 3 months, and then that's when you find that a task you did 2 months ago is being paid. But then the actual pay, when they pay someone in the US, they're paying them at $60 an hour. But then here you find that a task you did for 3 hours is paid at $0.01, but it's something that you took 3 or 4 hours to complete. So you find that the collective of 10 or 20 tasks from last month but one are paying you, and you get maybe $20 a week. So you can imagine, even with the cost of internet, with the expenses that you have in your house and everything, the amount is not sufficient. And therefore, we found that for a lot of people, they're forced to work 2 jobs. So you try to work in a BPO setting where it's like you go to a physical office, they give you a small stipend. They usually pay, for people in Kenya, they pay 20,000 Kenya shillings. But then just to get to the premises, because they go to posh areas, then you need to at least allocate 10,000 shillings just for transport. So you can see it's not enough. So a lot of people are forced to also, in the evening, when they get home, they now get onto the platforms and then try to work on the platform. So a lot of people are actually working 16 hours just to make what you're calling maybe around 30,000 Kenya shillings or 40,000 Kenya shillings a month. So as you're saying, the work is very interesting. You get to work on new technology, but then there's no recognition. I've worked in the industry since 2018, but I can't go to any other field and say, hey, I have 6 years experience or 8 years experience in this or that or that. It's not translatable to anything else. And then a bigger problem is that the data annotation or the data labeling services are not recognized as a formal occupation. It's like it's redundant. It's like your data entry, which it's still significant work because all these technologies would not exist. Also, for some projects, this mostly affects content moderators where they're looking at gruesome content the whole day. But you also have projects in data labeling where we have things like chat moderation, for example. We also had people who were training the GPTs. If you saw, there was an article that said that the Kenyan students are actually suffering now because even if you do a project by yourself, it is flagged as plagiarism. But this is because the GPTs have been taught, the LLMs, the large language models, have all been taught in Kenya, and therefore they've learned to think and communicate like a Kenyan. And therefore also it's brought a sort of a bit of a challenge on that side. But we had projects where we are teaching it the negative responses, for example, and you're supposed to give a description to the LLM to kind of teach it that this is a negative response. I find that you're working on these kind of projects for 8 hours a day for months. You can see how it goes and starts affecting people mentally. So we were faced with most of these challenges, but the problem is we never really had anyone we could turn to kind of assist us with these projects. But I would say that me personally, I was very fortunate to come across a client. I've interacted with other people as well who've also been able to get like good, decent jobs. Where you find that people give you a long-term contract. You find that they're investing in your growth. So it's not about like I have been working for a company for 5 years, but my role has never changed. Despite having qualifications as a project manager, they'll go hire someone from outside. So there's no career progression on my end. But then you find that there's some companies that are actually embracing all this. And so what we did as the association, seeing as we've now seen the negative side and we've seen the positive side, we kind of, as the association, came up with silos. Like these are the main challenges that we see are facing most of these workers. We are talking about fair pay. So there's poor pay as a challenge. We have poor contracts. We have mental issues brought about by this, and then there's no career progression. So we are trying to find solutions that could work. And what we are trying to do is we are not entirely bashing the companies, but we are condemning them for the wrong justices that they are doing, but also trying to find solutions that would work for both the company and the workers themselves. And so what we did a research. We interviewed around 211 workers, and we used that to come up with what we called a code of conduct. And with this, we tried to find organizations that do specific tasks. So for example, like for the fair pay, we found an organization called the Wage Indicator, and they helped us do a research. What is they do research in a country and figure out like, hey, if you're a data analyst in Kenya, like what is the optimum pay for you as a data analyst in Kenya? And so they did a research and found that, hey, for a tech company to bring jobs here, they are looking for cheap labor. But cheap labor, when they say it's minimum wage, they're talking about paying people $1 an hour for 8 hours. So it's like $8 a day. And then you find that maybe it's what translates to around 20K. But then we tried to find what's like still would count as cheap labor for the company, but then would be decent pay. So for example, we found that if they gave us somewhere around $2.6 to $3.2, we're talking about 60,000 Kenya shillings. It's still cheap labor for them because they're paying people in the US, $60, but then this is something that's working. And one thing we've seen is we have seen a company like Cloud Factory, for example, I'll mention them. We see that, for example, working there for 3 to 4 years, I was given a monthly contract. Yeah, I was given a monthly contract every month for 3 years. But then it's gotten to a point where they're now giving a 1-year contract. They're giving people paid leave. And then the pay has increased. It was at 1.25, but now it's gotten to a point where it's around 1.85 to $2. So we are starting to see traction, a bit of traction. It's still a long way to go, but at least there's a bit of traction that you're seeing from the tech companies. Yeah. So thank you.
For sharing all that. So what I'm hearing is even if there are opportunities, they often find people who don't have better options, right? So because because you've said some of the work actually requires expertise. They actually require people with degrees, people with master's degrees, people maybe who can afford the laptops that are required, but then these people maybe didn't find a job somewhere else, and so they had to, go into this work. So I will throw you the same question I sort of threw at Joanne, which is from the progress you've seen so far and from your experiences so far, you know, I know there's a lot going on in terms of policy discussions and CSOs that are working on these issues of data workers' rights. What would you want to see in terms of policy, in terms of the law protecting these workers, basically? What would you want to see, just in a few words?
Okay. I would say that conversations have started, but as we know, the law is very slow to catch up. Yeah, so we are hoping that things will come about, but we see that there's this, it's a very slow process because one, a lot of people do not understand there's a worker element to this thing. We were in a conversation with a big organization, and the conversation was mostly about how to tax the companies. And we got furious because we're like, hey, why are you ignoring this people part? But then once we start having conversations with people, you find that they don't even know about the plight of workers. So you find that it's a two-step process where we need first to educate the policymakers and then now start pursuing this other issue. And so we've been trying to do that from our end. We've seen people take up the conversations, but as usual, it's a very slow process, but at least there's a step forward, in my opinion. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And I believe even such a conversation as this is part of that work. I'm sure there's a lot of people here who maybe work in the same field in terms of advocating for workers' rights, and they're also, you know, here to interact and see what strategies can work. Thank you so much, Ephantas, for sharing. Now I'm going to move to Victor Ndede, our human rights expert. And Victor, I would want to just, from what we've heard from Ephantas and Joanne, and sorry, before I engage you, actually, I would want to run one poll, but I would want us to just contextualize, you know, human rights to what Joanne and Ephantas have talked about. But before that, I believe you can see a poll on your screen. I hope it's visible. So the question is, when communities provide data of whatever kind, be it, you know, language data, agricultural data, what should be the top priority for ethical use? There's fair compensation, ensuring inclusivity and representation, strong AI laws, strong data protection and privacy laws. I see people are voting. Thank you so much for participating. And really, this is in the context of the conversation we've been having. So there's a lot of data being collected from communities. What's the most urgent ethical concern that we should address? So the strongest, people are still voting, but the strongest so far is strong data protection and privacy laws. We have 52% for that answer. That's around 37 votes. People are still voting. So I will say all these are obviously important concerns to address. So fair compensation has come up in the presentations from Joanne and Ephantas, for example. You're hearing, and fair compensation is really both the amount and also just the process of compensating people. You're hearing people can do work and then they don't get paid for like 3 months or 4 months, and then someone pays them later. And also fairness in terms of why are the people doing the same amount of work in the US getting, did you say, I think Ephantas, you said $60 an hour or 16, while someone in Kenya is getting literally less than $1 an hour for the same amount of work. And you're saying that the compensation has improved with advocacy, but so that's also a very important concern to address. Ensuring inclusivity and representation, also very, very important. Strong AI laws and strong data protection laws are kind of tied together. Thank you so much for voting. I see we have 86 votes out of 140, so I think I will end the poll now, but thank you so much. The winner is still strong data protection and privacy laws. It seems privacy is a very important concern for this team. So thank you so much. I will end the poll now, and then we can now hear from Victor. Thank you so much for answering. So Victor, as I was mentioning, we've had the experiences of data workers in Kenya. We've had some of the challenges they face. As John started, you know, there's issues around compensation. There's concerns around, there's actually something that came up that I haven't mentioned, which is in the algorithms are making decisions in terms of even handing you the work and the amount of money you should pay for each task. So that there's obviously a power imbalance there where you're just interacting with an algorithm. You're not interacting with a human being who you can talk to. So I would want to just understand, Victor, from your work, what's the connection between this work and human rights? Also, are these digital rights we are talking about? And if so, what's the difference, if there's any, between digital rights and human rights? Are digital rights human rights? Are they as important and as fundamental as human rights as we talk about them? Yeah, so I just want to hear from you about that. And if you just could contextualize that in terms of the work that you do. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Josephine. Can you hear me? Okay, great. Just going to turn on my video for a bit. Sorry, I'm on the sidelines of a meeting, so I've decided to take it from from a car. Couldn't get a quieter room. But I'll just speak. So I think one of the things that that is very important when you look at the human rights context in this conversation on ethical AI, starting with what data curation looks like, what workers' rights are, and the AI outputs. So it's human rights on 3 levels. And to maybe make it basic is, in this conversation or this context, we are looking at human rights in data handling, human rights in the labor practices of the companies, and also looking at the human rights concerns around the impacts of AI. And so I'll start with the first one, which is on really data curation. And the previous 2 speakers from the Data Labelers Association have really talked about training of data, training of AI models using data annotation, data labeling. And the fact that data is used to train AI models, this data could then perpetuate what would be societal biases. And I think one of the very last examples was talked about. And so from a human rights standpoint, the key thing you're looking at here, the first thing you have to ask yourself is the question around non-discrimination and equality. And in the understanding that data can be biased, data can lead to outputs that actually discriminate against certain communities. And we've seen this in AI models that are used in predictive policing, for example, in Europe and the US, where they indiscriminately profile Black people to be criminals. It's a system that has been trained. If a Black person passes outside this ATM 3 times in the last 10 minutes, it sends a flag, and so he'll be stopped. So such things have actually, that data that someone input there has actually been used to target groups like racial and ethnic minorities, gender minorities, religious minorities. If you think about the case of Uyghur Muslims in China, and how actually the AI-backed surveillance tools have been used to discriminate them further, curtailing their freedom of movement, freedom of expression. It basically tells you about the bias that comes behind the data that people use to train. And so through a human rights lens, I think the main thing we're thinking about here is how do we identify and mitigate algorithmic bias that could deny people different opportunities. Think about, there are 2 very critical services that have now been are now being offered using AI tools, and that's the Social Health Insurance Fund, or SHIF. The SHIF, when you register for SHIF, if you're not employed, there's a means testing tool that has been deployed, for example. And in that tool, you fill in whatever income that is you perceive you get. You put in a couple of details on whatever they'll ask on ownership of different things and that. And then the outcome of it is a determination on what your monthly insurance premiums or shift premiums would be. But what people don't know is that it's an AI-backed tool, and it's not just using the data you input there, it's also scraping data from other websites, not other websites, but other government databases. So it's linked to something like the NTSA database. So you may feel there and say, I don't have a vehicle, but actually your name is appearing on the NTSA database as owning a motorcycle. And so it assigns a certain score to you already. And so by the time you're finished, you're getting a score that you're not quite comfortable with based on what it has determined. But that's an AI tool. And so we're seeing it apply in critical services like healthcare and even higher education. The higher education funding model, which was at least stopped by the courts, the question was also about the means testing instrument that is AI-backed that was being used and who sort of worked on that data. So that's the first thing. The poll, of course, has come up very clearly on the question around privacy and data protection. And the right to privacy is central in data curation, because when you think about data privacy or right to privacy in this context, you're thinking about data collection, data storage, and basically all the principles of data protection, if in the Kenyan context, looking at Section 25 of the Data Protection Act. Whether those things apply, transparency, necessity, data minimization, because the more data you collect and use, the higher chance that this data may actually lead to very negative outcomes for certain groups of people. The third thing in terms of the rights analysis, Josephine, is around freedom of expression, access to information, because of how much these tools are built, how much these tools are built with data that is available or data that people actually choose to put on these platforms. And if you think about it, if someone either places biased or incomplete data, in effect, actually, they're limiting your right to access information. They could actually suppress certain pieces of information, and which would then lead to questions around your right to access information and freedom of expression. Think about it. A couple of years back, when some research was done on YouTube, and I don't have the exact citation for people to follow up, 70% of what you'll watch on YouTube is decided for you by an algorithm. When you go in there to search, say, for example, you want to search a certain, say what, an example of a certain mobile phone, for example, and say I want to learn about the iPhone 17, the first video you'll choose, but all the subsequent videos and 70% of what you'll watch after that has been chosen for you by an algorithm. And so the question was, does this not affect your right to access information because a system is actually choosing what you should see and what you should not see? Because if the algorithm does not place it on your For You page, think about it across any application or platform that you use, there's a challenge. So those three would be very important. The next cadre of rights that would come to here in this context, in the context of this conversation, are the employer, or what we'd call the worker rights, and workers' rights being human rights. And you see the workers, and I use the term very loosely, because of course workers at times can denote already negative, attract negative consequences, because ideally people should be gainfully employed, and even in the context of a gig, in the gig economy. And so people working in the AI development space, from data annotators, as we've heard from our colleagues, to content moderators, are human beings, and they have human rights and they have labor rights as any other person. And by dint of that, is they have the right to fair labor practices. And you're thinking about the dignity of the labor. You know, when we had of the case way back against Summer, and I remember was it the New York Times a headline, which was a digital sweatshop, you know, like people are toiling day and night and still making very meager income. And I think our colleagues have also alluded to that fact. And so dignified labor and fair pay is something that is very important, because many of these tasks are often outsourced and performed by gig workers, and in very, very complicated conditions that often are designed that way to ensure that as little as possible employee benefits accrue to these individuals. And when you look at when you do a human rights analysis in the context of this conversation, you're looking at issues around fair pay and safe working conditions. You know, like access to mental health and safety tools, content moderators, for example, face significant psychological impacts based on their work. You're reviewing murder, you're reviewing mass killings, you're reviewing rape, you're reviewing defilement, torture. You're basically exposed to toxic content. But if you look at it from a right to health perspective, most of these employers or the business processing BPOs that run these gigs do not care much about this question on mental health and dignity of labor of these individuals. The other question that came up in the Daniel Motang case against Sama and Meta was the question around freedom of association, because you saw that people are victimized for trying to unionize. And form a labor union to advance their interest. And the right and freedom to associate is provided for in the Constitution. And people have a right to organize and collectively bargain because they perform and work in the same sort of business environment. And so human rights standards in this context would ensure that people in this, the gig workers, data labelers, they should be allowed to unionize and basically collectively bargain for fair pay, better working conditions, and all those things that pertain to fair labor practices. Denying them that right is a violation of freedom of expression. Lastly, Josephine, I'm sure maybe I've taken too much time, but the last aspect I talked about that I was going to look at was around the outputs of AI and the human rights impacts of that. And you think about it in terms of fair and due process in AI outputs. Like when we looked at the context of, say, predictive policing, and you're seeing advanced jurisdictions using AI to even do sentencing recommendations. It does an analysis of all the people who have been convicted of a certain offense, what the sentencing was, and then does a sentencing recommendation. When you think about this, there's huge potential for error and bias, but often there's very little space for due process to follow a person. It's very hard to actually appeal an AI decision. Ask anyone who has tried to appeal, for example, their shift their shift premiums that the means testing instrument has come up with. It's very difficult. The other thing on output is the denial of access to essential services. We're seeing an increasing trend where people are digitizing, or actually the word is digitizing social welfare. And so think about health. So if the means testing instrument has said, I need to pay 10,000 shillings a month, and I am the proverbial mamamboga of the current government, and I cannot make that much, then I am actually denied access to healthcare. We saw the same means testing instruments in the higher education system. Gives you a crazy amount of fee you're supposed to pay, or very little contribution from the government scholarship, in effect denying you the right to access education. We are seeing in other countries in Europe where they have even digitized social protection for the elderly, and they're still using AI tools to determine who should be paid and who shouldn't be paid. And so we are seeing that as a huge problem. And I think at the end of the line, there's a question around accountability and rights to remedy in the AI in the AI context. It's very difficult. I don't think there's a lot of conversations going that side. It's also largely maybe because of the literacy that this means this shift thing is actually an AI thing, and we should start asking questions about it. So there's a lot that we need to have conversations in the human rights context. There has to be accountability and remedy, because you see, if a decision is made by a human, even in a judicial process, there's an appeals process where if you are aggrieved at the magistracy, you proceed to the High Court, all the way to the Supreme Court. Whether there's jurisdiction, that's another story. But there needs to be a system of accountability and redress. I'll stop at that.
Well, thank you so much, Victor, for that really good discussion on just where human rights meets AI development. I like how you've gone throughout the life cycle, but I'll just pick on one thing, which is the last thing you mentioned on accountability. So I recently attended a discussion on AI and health, and we were having this discussion on who is accountable for, negative decisions or decisions that have negative impact. For example, on patients. And the example in health was radiologists are now using AI, for example, to identify whatever is in the imaging that they see. And the person who was speaking said that one thing we have to stay away from is try and assign blame to AI systems, because there's a person who is making the decision. They're using the AI, but the AI is not it's not fully or wholly making the decision. So I think that's one model that I found very interesting. So if, for example, it's a radiologist who's using an AI tool, then that person is responsible for the decision made at that point, because they will sign off on the decision. So I just found that very interesting as something we can apply in other ways that it applies, in other areas that it's relevant. But just to mention, the other thing that jumped at me is something that came up. So last week at the FIFA, which is the Forum on Internet Freedoms, was happening. It's a conference that's usually hosted by CPESA, which is an organization that works in Eastern and Southern Africa. And I was there as part of IRA, that's the African Internet Rights Alliance, which CPIT and also Amnesty International are members. And when Kenyan people or Kenyan speakers were talking about data workers' rights, there are people from other countries who kept asking, you guys, where are you getting these laws? Which laws are you using, for example, to unionize? Yeah. So, for example, there was a gentleman, I think from Nigeria, who could not understand which laws that Kenyans were using. But I like how you've contextualized some of these rights. So, for example, we can say that the right to health of these people who do this work is actually being violated, but it's not easy to see that connection and to see that the laws we have are actually applicable, even if this is a new domain. So thank you so much for that. That one on right to health, and also just access to information, the fact that an algorithm is determining what you see, then that's somehow affecting your access to information, whether fully denying you or limiting your access to your right to access information. So thank you so much for that. For that connection between human rights and AI development. Now I'm going to go to Irene to also just continue what I've mentioned, which is on the laws. So the laws that are relevant to labor rights, for example, for data workers, and the laws that are supposed to protect people who work in these platforms. And Irene did some research on this. So Irene, if you could just tell us about your research work. What did you set out to find out? What drew you to this research project? And also just tell us what you found out. So are there laws, for example, in Kenya or in Africa, if that was your scope? Are they, sufficient to protect workers? If so, how are workers using them to protect themselves? I think you also did comparative analysis with other jurisdictions. So if you could tell us about that. And as Irene comes up, so I see some of us are raising hands. I assume that's questions that you have. Kindly just type your questions on the Q&A, and we will answer them as we go on. But also at the end of the session, we'll have a Q&A session. So you can always wait with your questions if they can wait. If they can't wait, type them in the Q&A and I will respond, and we'll respond as we go on. Irene?
Thank you so much, Josephine. And I feel like the previous speakers have really touched on what my research was about. It was about AI and the gig economy across Africa, and specifically the applicability of our employment laws in protecting these, data workers and platform workers. And I looked at the challenges that these data workers are facing and what this really means to the AI outputs that we are getting from the systems they create. And then from there, I looked at the regulatory framework in Africa and specifically in Kenya, and compared the same with that of the European Union to know really why is it that the tech companies are shunning away from the European Union to get more cheaper labor from Africa. And looking at the regulatory gaps, then I came up with a few recommendations on what we can really do as Africa so that we can ensure that we do not expose our data workers to exploitation at the expense of creating AI systems which we know that are going to transform our economies. And specifically, I'm going to touch on a few challenges which Joanne and Fantas have talked about. Algorithm biases. The algorithms behind these platforms are very opaque. There is no explanation, there is no disclosure to the workers as to the criteria that is used when they are being assigned the task, when they are being remunerated, when they are being laid off. And we saw that last year when Remote Task suspended its workers from its own systems without even notice, without explanation. And the explanation was just the quality of work you've been producing is poor. And what Victor was alluding to, there are no remedies to that. There is no human in the loop for these AI workers to be able to appeal to when these algorithms make decisions that are biased against them. And specifically, I'm going to talk about the employment laws and data protection laws across Africa and how they compare to those in the European Union, and why I feel like we can adopt best practices that the European Union has adopted to protect their own workers. Ideally, we have very proper employment laws which are very pro-worker, and also the Constitution of Kenya, the foundation and which sets the framework for protection of workers and fair labor remuneration and aspects around that. And the Employment Act specifically, and any other labor laws like the Labor Relations Act and the WIBA, talk about social protections, insurance, sick leave, and all manner of leaves like maternity and even annual leave, and even stipulating the maximum amount of hours somebody should be able to work for, being 52 hours in a week, and the minimum wages for workers. But then you see our employment laws are a bit traditional. They only envision the formal employment, or rather the contract of service, and not independent contractors as we classify our data workers. And so my main problem from our employment laws is how they classify our gig workers, or they fail to recognize our gig workers, and specifically the data labelers as employees. So as a matter of fact, that misclassification then leads to them not being able to secure any social protections or any other protections that are afforded by the Act. And we recently saw that there is some hope, because recently the Court of Appeal in the Meta case held that workers can sue foreign companies in Kenya. There is locus standi for workers to sue for these foreign companies, and also the fact that this Court of Appeal also recognized that these data, or rather content moderators and data labelers, should be treated as employees. The implementation of that then will really depend on how our employment laws are structured, and we might need to rework our employment laws so that we can classify these workers as employees rather than independent contractors. And Fantas has clearly stipulated how this classification of these workers as independent contractors leads to them having to come up with their own systems, no protections. They do not have even recourse at court, because the Employment and Labor Relations Court is only made for people who are recognized as employees and not these data workers. And when I was looking at the European Union and its laws and how they endeavor to protect these gig workers, particularly the data labelers, they have a specific law which is called Platform Worker Directive, and the GDPR, and many other laws which specifically have best practices, which I cannot say are concepts that are very new to Kenya. They are concepts which are very well stipulated our Data Protection Act and even the employment laws. Specifically, they include there is an automatic assumption that every platform worker is an employee. So it's upon the company to prove that there is not enough direction and control to this worker for them to classify them as independent contractor. And in contrast, this is the opposite that is happening in Kenya. In Kenya, these workers are treated as independent contractors, and so most of the times they do not have recourse, no matter how bad they are treated. And then going to the accountability and transparency principle, which is also mirrored in our Data Protection Act, but the enforcement has not been seen yet since the enactment of the Data Protection Act. For the European Union, companies have been sanctioned for not disclosing to workers what kind of algorithms they are using, the kind of criteria the algorithms are using to make decisions, and even having a human in the loop. And the need of having a human in the loop then is to make sure that once a decision is made by these machines or these algorithms, then somebody has the right to appeal to these humans, and then they can be able to reduce or mitigate the biases caused by these decisions. So when I was finalizing my research, I was looking at the policy recommendations which I've already given, and then we came up with a checklist to guide both the data workers and the tech companies so that they can be able to ensure that our data annotators are protected, and it's this protection that then leads to an ethical AI output, because we cannot talk about ethical AI outputs when this data that is fed to these systems is of poor quality, is not accurate, it's inconsistent because of the kind of working conditions, the kind of payments, and any kind of treatment these workers are subjected to. And in this checklist for the data annotators, we were looking on how we can make sure that every time they're getting into contract with these tech companies, they can ensure that they're getting formal contract, because most of them do not even have formal contracts. Then that becomes a problem when it's time to enforce any inconsistencies, any unfair termination, and any problems they have. They're unable to enforce the same because the contracts are not in writing, they are not formal. Then we need to sensitize our data workers to be able to know that they need formal contracts, which have specification about the remuneration, the dispute resolution, them being able to appeal in case of decisions that do not appeal them, or any decisions that cause biases. And then to the tech companies, trying to educate them that in return of treating the data workers well, they'll be able to get better outputs for their systems, and trying to make sure that their policies match with our employment laws. If our employment laws provide for social protection, insurance, and accountability and transparency, which are provided for in our data protection under the principles, and also the aspects about automated decision making, then we make sure that their policies match with that, and there is continuous audit and monitoring to ensure that every time these policies continue to match with our policies. So it's not just a matter of policies alone. We also need to create awareness among the tech companies and the data workers. So yeah, that is what I have to say now.
Thank you so much, Irene. I especially like your final point. So you said part of your recommendations is that you developed a checklist, which is a tool that both the workers and the companies can use to assess whether they are meeting the right legal thresholds. I think that's really useful. And just to take us back to what I've mentioned, which is there were, at the conference I attended, there were a lot of people who didn't know which laws exactly they can rely on. And I think what I'm observing is there are laws that we can all rely on, at the very least, the constitutions, the national constitutions that we have. As Irene mentioned, the Constitution of Kenya is the basis on which all these laws are found. So, for example, Article 41 on labor relations, and all the other provisions that we can rely on. So I think that tool is very useful, because I think a part of not enforcing rights is lack of awareness that there are avenues that we can rely on. The other thing I like that you mentioned is on the automated decision making, and the fact that that's a very problematic issue, because then, as also Victor mentioned, it's very difficult to appeal decisions that are made by algorithms, and then you're really not interacting with a human being. And as you mentioned, for example, the platform Remote Task that was shut down, and even before that, you would hear cases of people who would perform tasks, as also John and Fant has mentioned. You perform tasks, and then for some reason that the algorithm decides, then you don't get your pay, and that's really problematic. I would ask you, for example, so we have the laws, we have the bodies. Maybe we need to do some review. But do you think the problem is actually enforcing the laws? Do you think that's where the main problem lies, that we have the laws but we're not enforcing them?
Well, I would start by saying that there is a lot of power imbalance. For example, most of the data workers are from Africa and low economies. And even with the high unemployment in Kenya, most of the youth are a bit of desperate, and they have to go for these kind of work as their own sole, or rather their sole source of income. While the tech companies on the other end are from the global north, and there is power imbalance, being able to control these tech companies is not really easy. And we need to be able to create awareness to these tech companies and show them that the treatment goes to, the kind of output they're getting for their AI systems. And really, in as much as we have the labor laws, starting from the Constitution and the Employment Act and WIBA and any other labor laws that exist to protect the employees, they do not include the data labelers as part of their employees. So the first amendment I would suggest would be to those employment laws to be able to include data labelers and every other gig worker and platform worker as part of employees, so that they can be able to enjoy the social protection and other benefits that other workers are enjoying. And then with regard to accountability and transparency, especially for the algorithms that are making decisions for these workers, whether they are going to their performance evaluation, whether they are going to get what kind of pay they are getting and the suspension of their accounts, we really need to. Our Data Protection Act, yes, really provides for transparency and accountability as one of the main principles of data protection, and even goes ahead and says that people should not be subjected to automated decision making. But then the enforcement of that is really what I haven't seen ever since the Data Protection Act came to force. I have not seen any case against a tech company to enforce this accountability and transparency of the kind of algorithms they are using in their systems. So maybe the enforcement for that one, I can fault the enforcement. Maybe we can make it a bit more stringent to ensure that we can check how the tech companies are able to make decisions that impact human rights, because Victor has alluded to the fact that this is a human rights aspect, and clearly the GDPR and even our own national data protection laws clearly say that automated decision, as long as it makes a decision that affects your human rights and your legal obligations, it should be with consent of the data subject, and it should have human in the loop. At the least, maybe the companies can have a human in the loop, so that when these kind of decisions are made against these people, then people are able to appeal against these biased decisions that are made against them. So I think that aspect will bring what Victor was saying about having remedies. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Irene, for that overview of what the challenges are, because, there's always that discussion of there are laws, there are bodies, where are we failing? Where is the enforcement failing? But also we've learned that the laws are not necessarily reflecting the current reality, which is the fact that labor is changing, and there's this new form of labor, especially for platform workers. How do the laws include them and sort of provide the right mechanisms? For example, the court, the fact that you mentioned the court cannot hear cases as labor cases, then that should certainly be corrected. So thank you so much for that. So I'm going to now go to Rebecca, and so I know a lot has been said, Rebecca. We've talked about the policy. We've talked about how do we ensure that we protect workers. How do we ensure that data curation is ethical so that we can achieve ethical tech tools? And I know that your work often really touches on inclusion and how to embed inclusion. And I think I've heard you mention before something about the Common Voices project and the fact that in the collection of data in that project, then you embedded inclusion. So I would want you to just talk about your work, or some case studies or some actual work that you've done in terms of embedding inclusion, embedding human rights, embedding ethical principles in data curation, and how you think that reflects in the final outputs, which is now the AI tools that we currently use. Thank you.
Thank you, Josephine. I think a lot of the presentation has really touched on important points that I also want to emphasize on. So I was doing work with Mozilla on the Common Voice project, and mostly what we were doing is curating data sets for NLP, natural language processing. Of course, for Common Voice, there were several languages that had been worked on, but specifically for Kiswahili, it was also a look at, how do we build intentionally gender inclusive data sets. And my role was really looking at the diversity and as well the gender aspect of the data sets. One thing that I did observe in the work that I was doing was a lot of times when we talk of building or curating data sets, we really think a lot about having as much data set as possible, having quality data set, having the numbers that we want to have, having that, enough both text and voice corpus that shows that you have done a lot of work. But most of the time we leave out the very important factors like intersectionality. For example, one thing that I found that was very interesting for me was the idea that even when we collect data sets that are representative, let's say, of women who are often underrepresented in AI data sets, you can also have gaps in intersectionality. For example, we realized that we only collected, I think, less than 5% of data from women that are 50 and above. So that is already a gap, an age gap in terms of the data sets that we collected. But then you also realize that there's factors around, the accents that people speak, the variance of the languages that they speak, the demographic dynamics of the communities they come from. So that factor helps you to realize that even when we are talking about building inclusive data sets, or building inclusive AI, it's not only about having the data set, it's also about thinking about these dynamics, which are often present within the communities we work in. We need to bring to the light ideas around how do we work intersectionally, how do we think of age, how do we think of the different diversities of the community, but we also think about the infrastructures and the communities we are working with, because they're the ones who lay the ground for this work. Most of the time, we want to collect data sets from rural areas. A lot of people are building for agriculture, and they want solutions that work for women in rural areas, but they don't think about the dynamics of these people. They are battling with power challenges. They're battling with the prices of bandwidth, prices of tech devices, which are expensive. So how do we enable that process to allow people in this kind of circumstances to feel included and to feel that this is something that is going to come back to them? That's the aspect about the downstream impact that we often don't consider when we're thinking about curating data sets. So for me, I think we need to have a pre, a during, and an after when it comes to data curation. We need to think of a plan before we collect the data, identifying what community we're going to work with, what are their challenges, what are their lived realities, like what really exists within their communities, and do they really need this work? Will this come back to them? And then when we're doing the work, we need to consider a lot of factors, including some of the ones that were mentioned when people are talking about data labeling. Who are the people who are going to work in this process? How are they going to be fairly compensated? What kind of biases will they also bring? Because every person brings their own perspectives to the process. So you need to consider exactly what do they bring to the table and how representative and diverse is that. If you're going to have a team of, let's say, only female of a certain age doing that process, then there's a likelihood that they're not going to represent maybe older people. Maybe they're not going to represent people who don't have the same technical knowledge as them. So there's that aspect of asking who is represented, who is not, and how do we bridge that gap. And then after the process, we need to make it as iterative as possible to allow for us to have a feedbacking mechanism for us to know what didn't work, where are the gaps, and how can we redress them. So it really needs, in essence, to be a cycle that you can go back to and iterate and make changes as you go through the process. I think another thing that I observed or I learned during the work was that a lot of times when we're talking about gender, we also do not identify the metrics in advance, and we often make them something that we do as a by the way or as an add-on, but not an actual implementation in the process. So we need to think about what are the data sets or the data that we want to represent with the information. For example, currently I've been doing a research with the Center for Economic Transformation in Africa Asset, and we have been looking at gender inclusion in AI for economic policy making. It's very interesting to see that the economic metrics when it comes to gender are not captured not only in policies, they're not captured even in the AI tools that are built for economic purposes such as tax, because we do know we have a lot of women who work in the informal sectors, but there are not enough indicators that capture these elements. So when we want to build inclusively, we need to think broadly what already we have in the systems that we have in the data that we have currently, what is missing. And also I would like just to point to the design justice principles, they always emphasize the need to center the voices of those that you want represented in the process. And centering means involving them in the whole process. Even when you want to do the data set, you need to think about how do I get more people to be part of this process? What do they want out of this? And how can I make sure that there's value added that comes to them? And then you also have to think of the unintentional consequences that comes out of it. Because one of the lessons that I got with the project is, as much as we're building open data sets, there's a likelihood that not local communities are not the one, it's possible that local communities might not use the data sets to build something for their community, but instead it's possible that big tech can use this data set to build something which this community will end up paying for again. So there's that imbalance that you have to think about. How does this look like in terms of impact to the communities? And that's why I think works like the Noodle license, by Strathmore really brings these things to aspect like looking beyond just having this data set there and open, but how does it look like for the communities who participate in the process? And I also would like to point that I think it's important to also look at it from a feminist perspective. And a lot of time when people mention feminism, they tend to think it's an issue around gender and it's an issue around, how women are participating in the process. But I think it's also an issue about social justice. It's an issue about looking at equity, looking at ownership. How do we get community ownership in every process and buying? Looking at things around care, because a lot of time when we do tech, we don't think about the care aspect of it. That's why the work that the data labelers are doing is missing that element of care, which is a feminist principle, because it puts people in that environment where their realities are not reflected. People don't think beyond that, the value that they get to extract. They don't think about the implications of the work. But when we center this work from a feminist aspect of like care and equality and community base, and we think about it in that angle, then we bring to surface the realities the communities face, but we also find solutions that are really rooted from the ground in what the communities really want. And for me, I think these are some of the things that will really shape how we look at this conversation and think about equality and think about ownership and think about having a process that allows us to, stop, regress, and look at what are the outcomes that have come out and how can we really properly address them.
Oh, thank you so much. I will just start by one of the final things you mentioned, which is the care principle as a feminist principle, and how we will often not think of that as the first, as maybe the first principle that we can borrow from feminism to then embed in all these processes. And I think if really we went even just with care, we will solve a lot of problems, starting with, the data workers and the challenges that they're facing. Because care ensures that you not only think of the product, you also think of the people creating the product, and you think of them as humans, and then obviously you make sure that their human rights are respected and are embedded in the process. So thank you so much for that. I will just ask you one quick one before we go to the Q&A. So one example of how to ensure inclusivity is to make sure that the people you want to include are embedded in the process. But one of the other gaps that you mentioned is that there's not a lot of gender data to reflect maybe, for example, how many informal workers are female, what are they contributing to maybe the tax ecosystem? Where do we start with correcting such a gap? Because it sounds like a very large gap in terms of data. If we've only been relying on, the same type of data, historical data throughout this time, where do we start? Just quickly, yeah.
Thank you, Joseph. I think we need to reevaluate our metrics, our data metrics. We need to go beyond, the numbers and the measures that we use to quantify what this data is telling us. We need to go beyond how we structure, like, for example, the informal work. I was in a conversation at the Gendering AI conference where people brought some interesting information. They were like, why do we call housemaids instead of house managers? Because if we put a name like a manager to it, it holds a certain value which is different from saying a maid. And that already people will quantify that as an economic job, specifically because of the kind of title that you put. But we also need to look at, what other mechanisms do they use to do, like to transact, for example? How do we leverage mobile money as one of the tools that most women use in the informal sector, for example? How do we equate time to an economic value, for example, for people who work in the care economy? So I think we need to reevaluate the metrics that we use in a manner that captures these dynamics. And this needs to be evolving because every day new roles are coming up, new ways of people doing stuff are changing. For example, before people would ideally open a shop and sell their stuff, but now a lot of people are moving to social media and they're announcing their projects on Instagram and other places, and then clients buy. But then this is someone who is probably not documented in government documentations as a business, but this is a business. So how do we create metrics that capture the evolving landscape of working maybe in the digital space or any other space that maybe is informal and not documented, like the retailers, the mama mbogas on the street? How do we quantify their economic value? So we need to reevaluate our economic indicators, but we also need to really work on the metrics that can capture this. We need to redefine how those should look like. And that would be a step for us to capture these things that are not represented, because the current existing tools that we use or indicators in these spaces or the metrics, they're very much also geared towards I would say a colonial mindset of what existed before, and not really the dynamics of the communities that we're working, especially in Africa.
Thank you so much for that. Often with policy corrections or policy actions that need to be taken, the answer is really just do it. I think that's what I've come to observe, because some of these challenges or concerns that we have sound so enormous that you wonder, where do we start? But really just redefine the metrics that start from there. And I think that's a continuous process. So thank you so much for that. And thank you to all the panelists from Joanne, Ephantas, Victor, Rebecca, and Irene. I will just move to our Q&A session. I see our time has run out, so we will just answer the questions as we move, and then the panelists can maybe give us a final word. So there's one here by Byron Nguithiki. I hope I pronounced that right. So the question is, given the constraints faced by most tech startups and financial hardship, how best can we have regulations that do not impose many obligations to comply, considering this might present a barrier to innovation? So I will allow me to assign this question to you, Victor. And just, so the question is, how do we ensure that, for example, startups are not overburdened by regulations? How do we balance, innovation and regulation, especially in the context of small businesses and small startups? And just as you answer that, Victor, maybe you can tell us, for example, what you've seen in terms of the reality of these questions. Have you seen that the laws are stifling innovation, especially in Kenya? Do you think there's something we can do there to ensure that this doesn't happen? And also just in that same context, there is now a lot of tech regulation and tech policy actions taking part in the continent. For example, Kenya, we recently launched our national AI strategy as part of the policy actions to regulate and have a policy environment for AI. Do you think that has friction with innovation? Do you think there's room, or there's room where we can maneuver to make sure that these policy actions don't hold back startups? I hope the question makes sense, Victor. Am I audible? And really, any of the other panelists, you can jump in. Irene, Victor, Rebecca, especially on the policy conversations and regulation, the balance between regulation and innovation. Sorry.
Okay, Rebecca, you can.
Sure. So I think it's to strike the balance between innovation and policy is it's critical, because one of the things that we're grappling with in Africa is that our policies are always trying to catch up with new technologies, and we're always jumping on the train when others are already working on things that are concrete on the ground. One way that I see it, we can position policy as an enabler for innovation. That is one aspect, like laying the right groundworks to allow for innovation to thrive in our communities. But at the same time, in governments that are restrictive or oppressive, they can use the same policies to stifle innovation. So I think we need to strike that balance. And we also need to ensure that we do not only, legislate restrictions, but we also legislate protections. In that manner, we should look at, what would this innovation impact be like to our communities? How would this impact the people who will work in these processes? How will that impact the communities who will be impacted, and have policies that already think about this? If we have this kind of existence already in play, then we can ensure that there's that kind of a balance where we do not restrict innovation by the policies we create, but we also do not allow for our communities to be impacted negatively by the innovations that are coming up. But for us to achieve that, we really need a holistic, multi-stakeholder approach, where actually policymakers can sit on the table and listen to what are the data laborers saying, what do they need to make this space thrive, and what is their role in the innovation ecosystem. They need to sit down and maybe work with communities that want technology to work for them, and identify what are their needs and what are their fears, and then kind of establish what this would look like. So I think we need to have that kind of co-creation process, but we also need to have the ability to strike the balance, so that we do not put more more focus on one element and leave the other. Because a lot of time when we start legislating, we forget the innovation side, and we just work on restrictions and regulations. And then when we focus too much on innovation, we also start forgetting things like protection. So I think there's that balance needed in between.
Thank you so much, Irene.
Thank you, Josephine. And I feel like Rebecca has really answered that very well. There is need to strike that balance so that we do not also stifle innovation at the expense of regulating, and also looking at it from the angle that regulation, if done well, is there to also make sure that the outputs of the AI systems and the treatment of our workers is human-centered. The aspect of having a human-centered AI rather than having very many AI systems, which we hope will be able to lead to development at the expense of our workers. So I feel like what Rebecca has alluded to is
Thank you so much. Thank you. And I agree with both of you. So my takeaway is regulation and policy actions, if done right, will actually enable innovation. And then we should not focus on one more than the other. And as I think Rebecca mentioned, if you want the interests of any group to be included, then you have to have them in the room. So even as, for example, the National AI Strategy was being created, the National AI Policy, there's a data governance policy, all these policy actions, and if maybe in the future there'll be an actual regulation, maybe a binding law that's supposed to regulate AI, all those actions should include the voices of startups, for example, just to answer the question of Byron. So Victor has mentioned that his network has some issues. No worries, Victor. Thank you so much. One other question that we have is, in context where state and corporate actors define ethical data curation, how do we guard against institutionalization of epistemic bias, especially where such curation aligns with political or commercial interests? Should a multi-stakeholder oversight regime be codified to limit this risk? What I'm hearing from this participant, that's Sunday member, is in situations where, so we have data curation, but it's serving the interests of one group. So for example, a government institution or a big tech company or some other person determines what we want this data to sort of communicate. How do we fight against that? How do we ensure that the data communicates maybe the interests of all people instead of maybe the interests of one, interest group? That's my understanding of the question. Any of the panelists want to answer this? Maybe Joanne, also you can mention if in your work, did you face any such situations where you're instructed on what the data should communicate? I've had this in cases where content moderators are instructed on how to moderate. I've had testimonials from a few content moderators. So Joanne, did you and or people who you work with, have they faced such a thing where you're instructed on your work to such an extent that it's clear that you're being instructed to serve a certain interest group? And any of the other panelists? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So when we speak about different projects, there are very many things that we've done that you even sometimes it slips your mind. But if there's this specific one I remember about, like the standards of beauty, for example, where you're told like this is specifically beautiful, so you're supposed to tag it as beautiful, and then for like different features of the beauty, where it's a sharp nose, it's the arched jawline, it's the blonde hair, definitely a white woman, and all those things. So most of the time, like most of the projects that we work on, we are expected to serve a certain aspect of, like, it's serving different people, because it's not my aspect of beauty where I'm saying a blonde woman or with blue eyes is the most beautiful person in this, but it's the project's requirement for you to term them as beautiful, fair, and all those things. So yeah, there are very many projects that you do that that you do not agree with, but since that's the requirements and the recommendations of the project, you are just forced to work on them.
Wow, that's really interesting context, because in our policy research you will find this defined, but it's very interesting to hear how you actually experience that, which is you're told you're not asked what do you think beautiful looks like, you're told this is what beautiful looks like. And obviously we know that affects the tools that we receive then to answer our questions, to to generate images and videos and all that. There's a question here before I move to the next question. There's a question on what are the requirements of being a member of Data Labelers Association? Must one have been in the data field for a given period of time? So maybe there are people here who are interested in joining the association. You can give them that information.
Usually we are representing the people who have been in the space, because if it's the isolation part, I feel we did not speak about that. Usually the different projects have different requirements, but what cuts across board is the fact that you're not supposed to communicate to another person what project you're working on. So mostly we are concentrating on people who have been in the space. One, to curb the isolation part, to sort of have a community, a safe space where you can have a conversation on the types of project that you're working on, or the work, the nature of the work, and how it's affecting you. So yeah, when it comes to the experience level, we do not, like, it's not taken into account. That we are not really looking into that, but you just have to have a background in the data labeling space or the content moderation space. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Emily Nyarechi. You can reach out through even their social media, and I'm sure they'll communicate with you. There's another question here from Vinrian Kamimba, who is a strategic data and IT advisor, is of the opinion towards the compensation of the data labelers. She believes that due diligence is crucial before you take up the gig, and it's very important to understand the contract in great details, especially when you're not within the locations of privilege. Companies are now doing direct outsourcing with very tight requirements, which holds direct outsourcing with very tight requirements, which hold them accountable. On the other end, third-party contractors, trainers should have very big hit. Think of the case of Appen, which Google used to train its model. John, can you comment on that? I see your hand is up.
Yeah, so first of all, until we started making so much noise online about the contract issues, most of these platforms do not give you contracts. It's the NDAs that serve as contracts. So you do not have anything protecting you rather than it's only the organizations that you're working for that are being protected. So you might want to be very critical with the contract that you're being given, but you do not have that contract. So again, it's just that you are maybe relying on their goodwill, they're going to pay you. Again, you're not even in a space where you can negotiate on the type of salary you can get. Most of the time, it's just you're working because there are no opportunities, and that is the opportunity that has presented itself. So in this digital space, most of the things that the other workers might take for granted, we do not have the liberty. We are not given them. They're not given to us. Yeah. So, and that is why we feel like there's a lot of challenges that are in this space because the bare minimum it is not given to you. Like even that contract that you're speaking about, you do not have. So you do not have a paper where you have they have like you can hold them accountable or they can be liable for what damages that they're doing to you.
Thank you. And Vindrian Kamimba has clarified that he's a he. Apologies for that, Vindrian. So as you've heard from Joanne, the issue is not that people are not doing due diligence on maybe payment and terms. The issue is that an NDA, which again is limiting you even from talking about your work, is what serves as the agreement. And I think this is what Irene was talking about, and the other speakers have also spoken about in terms of there being gaps in laws and also gaps in how you yourself, Joanne, and Ephantas and everyone else are, whether you're considered an employee or not. And if you were considered an employee with an actual contract, then it will be even much easier for you to actually enforce your right. So I see a hand up. Just as a final question before we close, I see we are 15 minutes past our time. Miss Linda Maina, you've raised your hand. You can speak. Linda Maina, you can ask your question. Or maybe it's an accident. I've seen it raised a few times. But if you have a question, feel free to also reach out to us after this through even our social media where we advertise this webinar. I think we can now close. And as we close, let's do a final poll. Sipit is going to run for us a final poll just to see our views as we close. I hope you can see it on your screens. So who should bear the main responsibility for ensuring ethical working conditions for data workers? 1, technology companies who outsource the work. 2, local subcontractors who work with the tech companies. 3, governments and regulators. 4, workers' unions. Who should bear the main responsibility for ensuring ethical working conditions for data workers? I see people are voting. I see votes are still coming in. Currently, governments and regulators is at the top and competing very closely with tech companies who outsource the work. We have 50 votes out of 95. I'll let the last few people vote and then we can close the poll. Who should bear the main responsibility for ensuring ethical working conditions for data workers? And as we heard from Rebecca, basically who should ensure care is embedded in this work. Okay, I think we can close the poll. So we have tech companies at 42%, and then governments and regulators at the top with 47%. So government and regulators and then the tech companies bear the highest responsibility. I think we can close that poll. Yes, and close the webinar. Mine is just to thank everyone who joined us for today's webinar, which is the first in a series of a few, about 3 that we're going to have before the year ends. I want to thank the CPIT team, obviously, for helping us organize. I want to really thank the speakers or panelists for joining us. I know that this conversation will continue and the work that we do will continue in terms of just ensuring that what we are talking about is actually embedded in policy and legal actions. Yes, and sorry, I think we've closed the poll. And just to also remind us, as you can see on your screen, we are going to have the second webinar in this series on the 28th of October. So you can always sign up for that. I think the link, you will see it in our social media platforms, and we will also share as we go ahead. So please join us for that webinar. It will also be a very interesting conversation. Picking up from where we've left this conversation. And if I could just, summarize this in one key takeaway, is that, we have the workers who are very key in curating data and in training AI systems. We have ethical principles that we should embed in the work that these people do. My takeaway is care. Of course, there's all the other ethical principles. There's accountability, transparency, but I really think care for me encompasses them all. And then we have actual laws and bodies. That's the legislative and stakeholder frameworks that are available to make sure that workers' rights are respected. There is a gap somewhere. So we have all those, but there is a gap somewhere because, workers are still experiencing challenges. And I think the gap is, the actions now, that's the actions that we need to go and do in our various capacities. If you work in government, if you work in policy making, or if you work in awareness creation, you can each, do what you must. And I think with each person doing a bit of their task, then we can make sure that workers' rights are respected and that their work is recognized. Even as we really enjoy the benefits of using AI, then we can know that there's someone behind these tools and respect that person and make sure that they're well treated and well compensated. I think I will just end there and thank everyone so much for attending and thank our speakers so very much for giving us their time, even in your busy schedules. And even as you're having other meetings, thank you so much. We can end there. You can leave at your pleasure. Thank you.